Hi everyone, it's really nice to be here and thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this. I am deeply honoured to be asked to speak, and I know that this memorial lecture is very important to you as a community, but also as a family as well. So thank you. Thanks, Joe, for also getting me involved in the Entrepreneur in Residence, and I'm really excited to see what the next 2 years brings. But yeah, it's all very exciting, and hopefully tonight I'll share with you my enthusiasm and my passion for healthcare and what it really means to me. So without further ado, we'll get started. So my lecture this evening focuses on an issue which is really very close to my heart, that of sustainable healthcare, and it's what will be the focus of my tenure as entrepreneur in residence. The impact of climate change in particular is having huge effects on global health, and the vicious cycle that the healthcare sector has found itself in and is perpetuating in some respects as a result of both technology, innovation and medical advancement. I will, of course, be looking at this through the lens of an engineer and engineering, and I'll highlight a little bit about what the engineering community is and could do to break this vicious cycle and create care solutions for the future that are environmentally, socially, and financially sustainable. But first, I want to share with you a little video. This is by, and I hope I pronounced her name correctly, Maria Kozak. She is an ex-nurse and she's also an artist from Denmark. And this is her personal experience of clinical care, and she has created some visual art pieces which have quite significance. And I know, Joe, that this will be something that will kind of touch you a little bit as well. So hopefully this will, okay. It would be nice if the slide moved on. Let's try the button. Well, I think you will all agree that just watching that video has a profound effect on you in terms of your view of medical waste. When you see just how much material is used and thrown away in just a single operation. And I would like you to bear in mind as I go through my lecture that in the UK alone, there are well over 1 million surgical procedures carried out every year. Some are relatively small, some are much larger than the one that was in the video, but all of them are unwittingly contributing to an already overburdened planet when it comes to sustainability. Despite the all-consuming mission of the global healthcare sector to do no harm and to protect society from illness and disease and death, it is, according to the NGO Healthcare Without Harm, the 5th largest emitter of CO2 on the planet. I'll leave that hanging for a second. The 5th biggest polluter. That puts us somewhere between Russia and Japan in comparable emissions levels. And the healthcare's climate footprint is estimated to be around 4.4% of global net emissions. That's the equivalent to the output of around 514 coal-fired power stations, making it as significant as food waste. That in itself is quite a significant contribution to our net global issues. So it kind of seems ludicrous to me, and I don't know if that seems ludicrous to you, that to think that through the act of caring for those suffering from health conditions brought about by environmental pressures, it is both directly and indirectly partially responsible for the conditions that they're suffering in the first place. Evidence shows that more than 70% of carbon emissions in healthcare are derived from manufacturing, transport, the disposal of goods and services, food and agricultural supplies, medical devices, hospital equipment, and consumable disposables, with energy consumption. So that's the consumption of within healthcare facilities themselves, adding a further 12%, and operational emissions and emergency vehicles accounting for 17% of the carbon footprint. And that doesn't include the emissions from patient and visitor travel to appointments and for treatment, which is kind of difficult to measure. But it's safe to say that it's in the tens, if not hundreds of kilograms of CO2 per person per year. So it's quite clear then that the healthcare sector, both clinical and technological, must address this alarming contribution to climate change in one of two ways. Firstly, by finding more effective ways to treat those that are ill, injured, or dying from environmental impacts. And secondly, to drastically change the way that healthcare services are delivered. So let's have a little deeper dig, shall we, into the issues and challenges facing global healthcare services. Well, for simplicity's sake, and I know there will be people out there who will sort of say this may be too simplified, but I think for the purposes of this lecture, this is the easiest way to think about it. We can divide it up into two, really. Social, which covers the physical care of the population in the form of medicinal and clinical treatments, and environmental, so external issues, if you like, such as weather, extreme heat, for example, living conditions, and also infrastructure, such as transport, utilities, medical devices and technology, etc. Of course, I'm well aware that these two groupings are not mutually exclusive. They do create a rather complex chicken and egg scenario. However, it does make it a little easier to define them in this way for the context of what I'm talking about. The World Health Organization has defined the impact of climate change on health in 4 broad categories. And this is how they've defined them. Direct impacts from heat and extreme events, indirect impact via ecosystems such as undernutrition or dehydration, changes in vector-borne diseases, things like malaria, for example, and indirect impacts via socioeconomic systems such as increased poverty and mass migration. To put this into actual numbers, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 global additional deaths per year between 2030 and 2050 as a result of just these 4 categories. And as I previously mentioned, the environmental and social relationship is not mutually exclusive, but the illustration I've put here supports these 4 categories. And it just shows how intimately these issues are related. So if we, for example, take the issue of air pollution, this will result in significant numbers of increases in asthma cases and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, leading to decrease in population activity levels. And that can lead on to early onset cardiovascular disease, for example. Mapping these causes and effects, it's very difficult to kind of calculate and predict what will happen in the long term. But if we look at, say, for example, the number of cases of malignant melanoma, that has doubled every 7 to 8 years over the last 40 years, mostly in fair-skinned populations in Western Europe, where hot days over 30 degrees have increased to between 15 and 30 days per year over the last 20 years. WHO has estimated that over 930 million people, that's around 12% of the world's population, spend at least 10% of their household budget to pay for healthcare, with the poorest people largely uninsured. Health shocks and stresses such as the likes of what we've seen with COVID are already currently pushing around 100 million people into poverty every year. However, many healthcare experts consider this to be significantly underestimated, as it doesn't include deaths from less understood effects such as mental health issues brought about by crises situations, and also physical injury that is sustained by those escaping from climate related upheavals. So turning to the environmental issues, as I said, think of this as infrastructure rather than just the natural world, if you like. But again, WHO has broadly categorized these in and defined the issues for each of these areas. So firstly, waste itself. This refers to the byproducts of clinical care processes. And this doesn't just include the surgical waste that we saw in that video. It's often including e-waste, for example. So the electronic devices that reach the end of life and are just discarded because something more innovative comes along, or because they're just not needed anymore. Wastewater. By way of another statistic, you will gather by the end of this lecture, I do like stats and numbers. Wastewater, in 2021, when delivering patient care, the NHS staff used 10 times more water than the average office worker. That was an annual cost of £60 million to the NHS. But it doesn't just include wastewater generation through the care of patients, but also through activities within the healthcare system supply chain, for example. So during manufacture and from inadequate health waste disposal as runoff into rivers and oceans. And frequent pollutants in hospital wastewater include things like pharmaceutical products, microorganisms, heavy metals, cleaning products as well, and other chemicals such as organic halogens and free chlorine. Emissions as a result of procured goods, direct energy use in healthcare facilities, and patient and staff travel are all contributing to this issue. And while there's no kind of definitive global figure, again, I refer to our wonderful NHS, that calculated in 2012, they produced 24.7 million tonnes of carbon dioxide emissions alone when it came to emissions. So to put that figure into context, that's roughly the equivalent of total emissions from the entire country of Croatia in the same year. And while the West, while here in the West we consider the management of toxic chemicals and pharmaceuticals to be a very high standard, there are countries, mainly low-income countries, who don't take the same kind of approaches as we do to processing these chemicals, and large amounts of hazardous chemicals, including things like mercury, polyvinyl chloride, flame retardants, and volatile organic chemicals are being put into put into the environment during manufacturing and also disposal of medical devices and equipment. And resource consumption. Now, this is kind of a tricky one, because we have to really drill down much further than keeping the lights on in a hospital. It goes well beyond that. Indirect consumption, for example, from electricity generation or the production of procured health products is quite significant. So, for example, disposable cotton materials in hospitals, used in everything from surgical gowns to swabs. They have a significant embedded environmental impact because cotton is a very water-intensive product and water-intensive crop to grow. So we need to consider those issues around the product itself. And when you consider that approximately there are about 2 million unique types of medical device available on the market today, then you start to realise just how much of an impact those sort of consumables can have in the manufacture, the transportation of those pieces of equipment, which often come from overseas, and also the operating life and the indirect pressures that is having on the environment is almost, well, it's almost impossible to measure. So we can safely say that we are a bit on the precipice of being overwhelmed by our drive to save people from illness. Air pollution, infectious disease, poor food quality, weather, energy, transport, and over-reliance on unsustainable supply chains are really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to global healthcare and the problems that we face. We certainly can't continue in the way that we are. So now I've thoroughly depressed you, and I'm sorry about that. Let's talk about some of the more recent achievements that have begun to address these challenges and the way that we might get out of this mess that we are kind of creating for ourselves. So, action on climate change, I don't really have to tell you that the people in this room are very familiar with this, but it has become an important topic in every sector, as we know, from industry and business right through to the arts, and at all levels of policy and strategy. And it's given rise to a global response from nations and international outcry across the globe. The seismic shift, I suppose, over the past few decades has been hastened and supported by a number of factors. Increased public support for action on climate change and environmental issues has given governments a strong imperative and mandate to act. And this has really given health education a significant boost, focusing on ways to improve nutrition and lifestyle in the West, while reducing the reliance on carbon-based fuels, for example, in the East. The public have become much more savvy to the products and the product manufacture and supply chain, and are demanding much more environmentally friendly products, goods and services. And while that's not necessarily affected the medical device and equipment market as such, the demand for things like vegan-based medicines and food is on the increase in hospitals worldwide. Patients too are looking for their healthcare providers to provide clearer explanations of how they're achieving sustainable goals. And this has certainly come to the fore during COVID. Higher income nations are seeing a trend towards the access to healthcare data, and the environmental impacts of treatments has been something that patients and society are wanting to see more of. And the outcome of the COP conferences has definitely put climate change front and centre in healthcare in particular. And we've seen several international agreements develop in the last few years, which have allowed the medical and the medtech resources of the West and the expertise to be pooled and distributed to where it will have greatest impact. With extreme heat events increasing worldwide at an unprecedented rate, and a 6-fold increase of concurrent heat waves since the 1980s, these kind of sustainability and investment agreements have now significantly impacted the health and care of people in low-income conditions, where disease and illness can't be held in check and is causing mass migration events to occur. So subsidies for green energy use and requirements for companies to report on their environmental impact, while initially time-consuming for the most part for a lot of businesses, are now increasing in nature. And particularly businesses in the medical technology industry are seeing the fruits of their labours when it comes to ensuring that they have identified their environmental impact. And there's also been quite a drive towards providing employee health programs. And that I'm not talking about insurance, I'm talking about providing indirect boost to healthcare services as a way of making sure that the workforce is well looked after, and better treatment and faster response to healthcare is having a significant effect in some countries. And greater investment in research. I know some of you come from the university itself and are very familiar in this with this respect. The opportunities to invest in research to develop and evaluate new technologies, new interventions and strategies to mitigate or adapt to climate change are growing in interest and at pace. And funding support to multidisciplinary research particularly is having a real effect. I was talking at lunchtime actually about the opportunities to look at things like non-communicable diseases, such as asthma, cardiovascular disease, and dementia in particular. These are having significant effects on society. So these are all kind of wonderful starting points, but we can't sit back on our laurels. We do need to ensure the longevity of some of these initial impacts that we've had on healthcare. And that is something that our UK NHS has decided to do. And it's nice that that some of our NHS representatives are here tonight. They are pressing ahead with a radical sustainability programme, and it's going to have long-term consequences to the whole of UK society, and is certainly going to act as an exemplar to other countries. We, and I particularly, are very privileged in the UK to have probably the world's greatest public healthcare provision, not just at the point of care as a point of care service, but in the investment into life-changing technologies and medicines that have occurred over the last few decades. Technical and clinical advancements and innovations have become ubiquitous, really, in our everyday care. And diseases and disabilities that were once considered impossible to treat 75 years ago are now pretty much run-of-the-mill for most clinicians. The paradox, however, for the NHS is that whilst it provides over 7% of the UK's GDP, buying in goods and services from over 80,000 different suppliers, it accounts for around 4% of the country's carbon emissions. And in line with global figures, more than half of the NHS's emissions, that's around 62%, are linked to supply chain and procured goods such as medicines and equipment, while around 14% are linked to emissions, particularly around travel and those sort of areas. And this kind of, for a country of our size, would seem fairly insurmountable. But I have to say, the NHS have pretty well stepped up to the mark. In 2020, the NHS decided that they wanted to become the world's first national health service to be committed to delivering a net zero service by 2040. And they implemented what they call the Greener NHS initiative. To achieve this, they not only had to change the way that they cared for patients across the hospital network by opting to use more sustainable methods of treatment, but they also had to radically transform the way that they selected and used products and services to drive change across the entire supply chain. That's not a small task. The Greener NHS team was led at the time by Nick Watts, a very enthusiastic, I think he was Australian. I'm right, yeah, Australian. And I actually had the pleasure of interviewing him for a podcast some time ago to talk about implementing this initiative. And I've placed here on the side, and I'll make sure that this is available. If you want to have a look at that intro or listen to that interview, you can have click on the QR code there, and the other side is actually the Greener Initiative report if you're interested in having a read of that, and I do suggest you have a look at it. I'll leave that up for a second. Nick has now moved on to other things, but he believed that by building pride in the organisation's achievements and taking really bold and decisive steps, but achievable steps, that the NHS could reach the standards of the Paris Climate Change Agreement and could, in turn, see over 5,700 lives saved from improved air quality alone, some 38,000 lives saved from a more physical active population, and over 100,000 lives saved from healthier diets each year. So 3 years on from that, or we're now into the fourth year, I suppose, are they progressing the way that they hoped to in 2020? Or was this just another flight of fancy, an initiative which, wasn't really going to go anywhere? Well, they have been extremely successful, I am very pleased to say. The NHS as an organisation and its staff have wholeheartedly adopted the initiative, which has now become embedded across the whole of the care system, from simple reduce, reuse, recycle kind of processes, right through to some hospitals completely decommissioning their NOx cylinder manifolds and taking out their whole NOx systems. And they've achieved this really by creating a sort of an 8-point mission plan, really, if you like, to look at the issues and challenges that they're facing and cluster them together. And that's enabled staff to kind of manage the different across different trusts and across also different priorities of care, because not every trust is the same, not every service is the same. So there was no one size fits all. It had to be flexible enough for these organisations to be able to implement it if it was going to be successful. And this meant that they could not have to focus on KPIs and stats and all of that stuff, but actually get things done. And by structuring the mission in this way, they've been able to maintain that impetus over the last 3 years and demonstrate the impact and outcomes that can clearly be seen, not just by patients, but also by government, who are obviously always looking over the shoulder of our NHS. So I thought at this point I would share with you a few examples of some of my favourite projects and the outcomes that they've achieved, just as a taster, if you like, of some of the things that can happen. So this is one of my favourites. These are under test, if you like, at the moment. These are drones that are supplying cancer. Yes, the word is missing from my brain. Chemotherapy drugs, that's it. They're under test at Southampton University, flying from the hospital in Southampton. What the success that they've had so far is that they've been able to reduce a journey which would normally take 4 hours down to 30 minutes, which is incredible. So normally somebody would have to get in a car, drive all the way to the ferry port, wait for the ferry, get on the ferry, get off the other end, drive to the hospital on the Isle of Wight and leave the materials, and then do all of that going back. Now they can fly this material and other things via drone and be over into the Isle of Wight and back again in 30 minutes, which I think is amazing. This seems a fairly obvious one, but nonetheless has had great success in reducing particularly NOx emissions. The Greater Manchester Trust have been using 2 heavy goods vehicles for transporting supplies to and from hospitals, and they have already seen a huge saving in CO2 and NOx emissions over the time that they've been used. So having vehicles on the road. Now, I will just slip in the fact that I was telling Joe about this. I was told by Nick Watts that at certain times of the day in both Manchester and I think Birmingham as well, there are more vehicles on the road that are related to healthcare than any other form of vehicle. So, you know, the impact that having vehicles like this delivering supplies to healthcare facilities is really going to significantly reduce that impact. You may have seen probably on the television recently that Birmingham Hospital and I think also Guy's and St Thomas's have achieved something which probably even a year ago we would have thought was impossible. A completely net zero surgery, and they were all able to reduce the carbon output by almost 80%. So the equivalent of a diesel car travelling around 5,500 miles. Not bad, really. And in fact, the 2 consultant surgeons, one chose to jog to work that day in order to make sure that they could pull the level down even more, and the other one cycled. So we saved some money on the consultants there for a short way of time. But you will have seen since then that several hospitals now have achieved the same goal. So we can demonstrate just how much we can achieve by reducing the impact of the materials that we use. And this is another one which, for those of you who've had children, who've got children, is quite a significant one as well. Nitrous oxide has 300 times more global warming capacity than carbon dioxide, and finding ways to recover that after surgery is something that that engineers particularly are very keen to try and do, because you can suck it out of a patient, believe it or not. It is something that you can recover. So this is a great opportunity to try and address that particular issue. In this particular case, they've eliminated 99% of the nitrous oxide that would have been released into the atmosphere, and that is going to have a significant effect to the hospital's impact. So, excuse me. So they are just a few examples of some of the achievements that have happened over the last few years with the implementation of the Greener Initiative. And I think really over time, those kind of achievements are only set to grow. And they are going to affect the upstream supply chain. And the NHS needs to start thinking about how they are going to affect that change. So I thought I would explain here, just so you can get a feel for what that roadmap will look like. So obviously we're looking at here at 2022. Excuse me. The implementation of the programme, they started to look at within themselves the carbon reduction plan and how they were going to minimise their carbon emissions. By this year, they want to extend that to cover all procurement. So they focused on very specific issues initially, those that were the biggest winners, if you like, in terms of carbon reduction. Now they're focusing on the whole procurement process. By 2027, all suppliers will be required to report their targets, their emissions, and publish their carbon reduction plans. I guess that's in line with other industries, but at least this gives a smaller step-by-step change for the medical devices and supply chain. By 2028, the requirements will be introduced to oversee the provision of the carbon footprints for individual product supplies to the NHS. So there are some that they want to try and address a little, or focus on a little bit more than just, you know, everyone else. You have to remember as well, if you're not aware, the supply chain and the companies that work in the medtech space particularly are 95% small businesses. So they're usually less than 100 people, if not, you know, only 10 or even one person. And some of those companies only have one customer, the NHS. So this is going to be significantly a big impact to some of those smaller companies, and we have to take it step by step to make sure that they can cope with this kind of change. By 2030, the NHS will insist that for a supplier to qualify for their contracts, they will have to demonstrate both their carbon emissions and the progress that they're making, and publish that so that everyone can see the impact that that company is having. They've implemented the Evergreen Sustainable Supplier Assessment, which hopefully will help these companies to focus on what they need to do. And in fact, they've got now an entire team of people who are there to assist suppliers to help them go through that process. So it is going to be achievable, I think, from that point of view. I think there'll be a lot of teething problems. I think there'll be a lot of companies that will really struggle. But I think over time, this will enable not only the NHS to reach their goals, but it's going to help these companies also address their issues in the long term as well. So I guess you need to understand why I'm standing here and babbling on about this particular issue, and what the engineering community are going to do to help drive these sustainable changes, not just for the NHS, but globally, You know, we focused in this room very much on the UK aspect of this, and the NHS is very unique in that respect, but we have this opportunity to look at this from a global perspective. Well, I should say that like clinical professionals, engineers have the power of life and death in their hands often. And just like clinicians, chartered professional engineers have a Hippocratic oath of sorts in the form of our code of conduct. And in that, we agree to not compromise the welfare, health and safety of society, and to safeguard the public interest. In more recent years, our accreditation body, the Engineering Council, has recognised that beyond the basic requirements of becoming a professional engineer, we have to be much more aware of the impact we have on the world around us, and that we can justify our actions for not just the greater good, but also to enable us to speak openly and honestly with the world outside us. Too often engineers keep very much to themselves, and we don't say very much, and we just get on with the job. But we now have a responsibility to speak broadly and openly with everyone around us. Oops. I hope I didn't press the button there.
I think you might have switched off.
Oh. There we go. Sorry, did I lose you, everyone? Hello. You're fine. You're still here. I guess it seems obvious, really, to me. I don't know if it really means much to some of you, but we as engineers have to play a leading role in implementing sustainability and net zero initiatives. It is innate in what we are and who we are. And none of the examples that I showed you previously would have happened really without engineering involvement, but we are, as a profession, very much in the background. But if it wasn't for these people here who are biomedical engineers, clinical engineers, straightforward mechanical or electrical engineers, we wouldn't have achieved the goals that we have achieved so far, and certainly our clinical colleagues wouldn't be able to achieve some of their goals without the clinical engineering community. But engineers and engineering ultimately have got a responsibility to drive the development and adoption of sustainable and green alternatives going forward. And we are going to act as a linchpin, I believe, that ensures the longevity of some of these changes, particularly in the NHS. Of course, we're all ultimately responsible for ensuring our health and healthcare are sustainable for the next generation. But my passion for engineering kind of outweighs that, I think. And it's one of the reasons why I'm taking up this position as entrepreneur in residence. And these kind of opportunities are so important, really. In the coming year, I'm going to be applying my engineering skills and knowledge in combination with Durham University Business School and the Energy Institute to address four particular themes. To understand to get a better understanding, really, of what sustainability in healthcare is, how we can ensure the products and services that we design are equitable for all, communicating the value and importance of sustainable healthcare services to wider society, and enabling everyone to have an input into addressing the challenges that we face. And I hope that with your help and your support, we will be able to achieve that over the next couple of years. So I've called this a call to arms. I'm not sure whether it is in some respects, but I would like you to help me with this challenge. There remains a significant issue for the NHS, which is yet to be addressed, and that is workforce. There are simply not enough engineers working directly in the NHS to sustain these changes in the long term. Presently, as far as I'm aware, there are only 3,000 clinical engineers across the entire NHS network. And there's an equivalent number of medical physicists, and there are a few more people who work in estates. But that's clearly not enough for an organisation that treats 1.3 million every 48 hours, something like that. So whilst industry will certainly be in a position to produce the technology that we need, creating effective management of that technology really has a question mark hanging over it. We have an opportunity then to encourage more people to take up engineering and technical roles in the NHS and in industry, not only to increase engagement with their clinical colleagues, but also with patients and carers and the general public, to help them to understand how they benefit from medical technology and respond to their concerns within society about what we are doing about sustainability and climate change. This would help grow an already impressive pocket of success that I've talked about tonight in terms of the examples I've given into a much wider successful process of sustainable projects. And I think that will be key to creating a bigger workforce. We also have a duty to ensure that the businesses that we work for, as I say, a royal we, are preparing themselves for the sustainability requirements of healthcare providers and ensuring that our green credentials are clear for everybody to see. We need to wear them as a badge of honour, and I think that, for me, is why I'm so passionate about this particular subject. And we've got to raise our voices to talk about these issues more publicly, and enable young engineers particularly to have a seat at the table to help make change and make decisions happen. And lastly, I think we need to increase pressure on government to create more coherent strategies for healthcare, in particular when it comes to sustainability. And we've got to stop paying lip service to the climate crisis and provide long-term planning for global climate events, and particularly how that affects healthcare. So, in conclusion, the global impact of climate change is undeniable. As the Lancet Countdown report from 2021 stated, the world is not on track for realising the health gains of the transition to a low-carbon economy. Air pollution, infectious disease, as I've already said, poor food quality, weather, energy, over-reliance on our supply chain are really just the tip of the iceberg. Engineering is going to play an active part in addressing many of these healthcare issues, directly and indirectly. But these are often hampered by the monumental lack of foresight and long-term strategic planning from our global governments, and the titanic challenges of societal inequality in particular. So, if we are to answer Maria's question of, is there another way? My answer is yes. Yes, there is another way. But if the global healthcare community is to reduce its carbon footprint in the next decade, then sustainable health technologies, innovation, investment, and awareness must be at the forefront of every nation's climate change policy to address the unhealthy mess that we find ourselves in. Thank you very much.